Welcome to Low Income and First Generation Students for CEPD 6178. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about factors that are related to students that identify as or are identified as low income. We're also going to be talking about students that are first generation students and what factors are related to that. We're going to discuss the intersectionality of race and ethnicity as it relates to low income and first generation students. And we're going to discuss on methods for engaging these types of students. But before we get into that, I want to have a quick conversation on first generation and low income. And it's very difficult to have a conversation separating these two, because more often than not, a student that is first generation is also likely to be low income and vice versa. And that's because their parents, who do not have a college education, are also more likely to have a lower income than a student who's second or third generation whose parents went to college. And we also know that first generation and low income students are also more likely to be minority, and that's essentially due to the historical past of the United States and the oppression of education and not focusing on education for minorities until recently. So what does that mean for the student in terms of outcomes for college? Well, there's no difference. A first generation and low income student who completes college will have a very similar experience in terms of the outcomes and the development and the identity development. The biggest difference will be the challenges that they have to overcome to get to graduation. That's where the difference is for first generation and low income, for second generation and non-low income students. So the experience is similar, the outcome is similar, but the challenge is getting to graduation. And there are various reasons to that. So a lot of what is attributed to first generation and low income students is a pre-college impact, or what we know as inputs. And for first generation students, they don't necessarily have the same types of information or the same level of awareness of what it means to go to college. What questions do we need to ask for financial aid? What do we need to bring? Why do I need to engage on campus? We don't need to live on campus. And that connects to lack of resources, because low-income students may be less likely to live on campus, which we know living on campus can significantly increase the levels of engagement and connectedness to campus. And we also know first generation and low income students may have lower academic preparation because they may not have been afforded the same opportunities as their more affluent or second or third generation counterparts. So all of these different factors here really contribute to the input and the characteristics that these students are bringing into college that will have a small impact on their environment, but in a very different way. We'll talk about that in a minute. But before we discuss the college experience of first generation low income students, we need to look at some definitions of what classifies these students. And before we can get into a discussion on low income, we need to talk about the poverty level. And this is how low income is technically defined. So for students in a family of 4 that are have an annual income of $0 to $20,000, they are considered below poverty. The poverty line is generally $20,000 to $25,000 for a family of 4. And I want you to acknowledge this number right here, the 0 to 100%. When you see this number, 100% or 100% of poverty, it's essentially saying $20,000. The $20,000 is the baseline for poverty. So then when you see the working poor who are at 200% of the working poverty level, then that means that they make $40,000 for a family of 4. And the working poor are considered between $20,000 and $40,000. So then everybody above $40,000 for a family of 4 is considered above poverty. Now this is a little troubling because $40,000 for a family of 4 is very different than $100,000 for a family of 4. But even the $100,000, we don't necessarily know what their financial situation looks like. They may have 2 kids in college, have a mortgage, and other types of financial obligations that significantly affect the earned financial or the expected financial contribution. And we're going to talk about the EFC as another indicator for low income. So essentially, when we look at charts, what we'll see is 200, 300, or 400%. And essentially what that means is this number multiplied by 20,000. All right, so you'll see 200% is $40,000, 300% is $60,000, 400% is $80,000, etc., etc., etc. So low income is generally considered these two groups right here. But you may have some low-income students that are in the above poverty section. It just really depends on a lot of different factors. And we're going to get on that here now. So for the factors, it depends on dependency status. So if you have, say, a family of 6, you have 2 parents, 4 kids, those 4 kids are going to significantly affect the income. So $100,000 for a family of 6 is going to be very different than a family of 2 and $50,000. The same thing as the attendance status. So how many kids are going to college? And I've already talked about the family size. So all of these different things really play into what it means to be low income. And I already talked about the poverty level as a family of 4 that makes less than $20,000. But I mentioned a term, and that's the expected financial contribution. And this is a number that is calculated by FAFSA and the government to determine what a family's level of contribution is to college. So based on this, if you make if you make $23,000 or less for a family of 4, your automatic EFC is 0. The family is not expected or estimated to contribute any money to a college education. This is an automatic default for low-income students, for EFCs that are 0 and families that make $23,000 or less. All right, that's an automatic low income. But like we talked about, you can have a family that could be low income that has a large family, multiple kids in college, and may have a mediocre EFC. So really, for our purpose, we're going to be defining low income as poverty level at 0 to 200% for a family of 4. Now, it really just depends on the individual themselves. So what am I getting at? Well, I'm getting at that there's no easy definition for low-income students, because you can have a family that's making $150,000, have 5 kids, have 2 mortgages, and have an EFC that's very small. So it really just depends, and the low income really can be whether or not students are able to go through college without worrying about money. And you may be thinking, well, a lot of college students can't. Well, there's a difference between needing money and wanting money. Some low-income students may need money or may not even have money to purchase books. They have to work, where other students don't need to have to work, do not worry about where the money's coming from to pay for the books, and low-income students may need to rely solely on financial aid and grants and scholarships. And if they don't have that, they cannot go to college. So what does that mean for first-generation students? Well, this is a little bit easier to define, but yet there's still no real agreement on it. Our definition is essentially going to be parents that do not possess a college degree. It's simple, it's clean, it's to the point. But other definitions may exclude that parents who have some college but no degree. Because the thought is that a first-generation student's not really first generation if their parents have some college experience, because then they have some information to contribute to their student. The same is true for a vocational or technical degree. But I personally don't agree with that. I believe that parents who do not possess a college degree aren't able to fully contribute to their students' experience in college and aren't able to fully help navigate and negotiate the college experience. Now, I myself am a first-generation college student. My mother had a little bit of college, but neither of them have a bachelor's degree. So there are a lot of things that I can relate to in this lecture. So what does it mean for low-income students in their college experience? Well, the first and most obvious one are financial barriers. Being a low-income student can limit access to certain things. It can limit access to the type of institution if there aren't scholarships or financial aid. It can limit access to different types of activities such as unpaid internships, and it can lead to increased student debt when students don't make smart decisions in terms of the type of institution they want to attend. And that's a real big issue right now in terms of student debt and low-income students. So institutional barriers is that they may be restricted to solely in-state institutions, and they may be restricted just to public in-state institutions. But again, it just goes back to the student debt and acquiring student loans if they want to go to a private out-of-state institution. But you see very few low-income students go to private out-of-state institutions when they don't have full scholarships or a lot of other outside money coming in because the family contribution is so minimal. But students may do it and just take out everything in student loans. The other piece are family barriers. Families may not necessarily understand what it means to support the student in terms of low income, and they may not be able to. So if a student calls home and they need $20 for something, but their family literally cannot give $20, that can create some additional barriers. It may prohibit the student from engaging in activities. Fraternities and sororities are immediately off the table. So there's a lot of different things that fall into play here for family barriers and low-income students. And they just may not have the financial support to do certain things. Then the other piece is engagement. Low-income students are much more likely to work, and they're more likely to work a lot than their affluent counterparts. And what I mean by a lot, I'm talking anywhere between 20 to 40 to 60 hours a week. And that goes back to not only help themselves, but to financially support their family. So they may not have the family support, but they may still be expected to support their family. So it all just depends on the individual student's situation. Now, working all the time can create some academic barriers. And we know this, that the academic barriers will be a part of the environment piece in the IEO model. Because if they're working 40 to 60 hours a week, their environmental experience is going to be very, very different than a student that doesn't have to worry about. So the input of the low income will then have an effect on the environment, but the output, as we know, may not be as significant if they're able to get to graduation. It's just going to be a lot more difficult for them to get to graduation because of the financial, institutional, family engagement, and academic barriers. So these are all the different types of things that low-income students need to overcome. Now, what does the low-income student look like? Well, here I have a chart it's about 10 years old that I pulled from the Education and National Center for Education Statistics. And we can see that at or below the poverty level, which is $20,000 or less, we can see here the numbers, and minorities are more likely than white students to be low-income students. Now, as we move up in the poverty level, or the percentage of the policy, we can start to see, again, the numbers, how they reflect going down. Now, the 201% or above, that could be anything from $40,000 all the way up to $500,000. So when we look at this number here, it's a little misleading because we can't exactly see what it is that it's referring to. But you do get the general idea that low-income students are more likely to be minority students, and we talked about in the previous lectures that has to do with previous historical misgivings. So what does the first generation student face? Well, their disadvantages come from lack of family support, and that can be in two different ways. The first one is they're not able to support the student educationally. They're not able to understand what the student's going through on a college campus. The other piece is they're not willing to support because they feel the student should be at home with them supporting the family. So there may be some disagreement there. The other piece is that first-generation students may be missing opportunities on college campuses because they don't know to take advantage of them. That could be anywhere from scholarships to financial aid to campus organizations. They living on campus because they're living at home. It could be a variety of different things. First-generation students are also more likely to have transitional issues than second and third generation students. They're more likely to miss their home, miss their family, and aren't able to fully make that transition to college campus. And that's really connected to their ability to navigate the college campus. There may be some difficulties there. But again, this is generally speaking. Two first-generation students may have two completely different responses to the college campus. So it really just depends. The other piece is that first generation students have a lower degree attainment or a lower retention rate. And a lot of that has to do with the disadvantages that we just talked about, because they may be called home to help their family. They may have transition issues. They may feel homesick. They may not be able to navigate the college campus, or it may be too big for them, or they may be missing opportunities to get that support. There's a variety of different things that really affect the first generation students' retention rate. Now, in terms of the academic preparation, we're going to see very similar things to low-income students. They've had fewer opportunities because they may be low income during their K through 12 experience, so that will affect their inputs, which we know will have an effect on their environment. And all of these different effects right here that go into inputs will have an impact on the way they interact with their environment on the college campus, because if they're missing opportunities or they're not transitioning well, then it's going to have an impact on their output. So what we're going to see here is that for first generation students, the impact really starts with the input for them. And then if we need to be able to provide that support in the environment and able to help the students get to graduation. Now, let's take a look at some low-income and first-generation students. So here, I've actually worked on this chart a little bit so that we can see a breakdown of first-generation students compared to second-generation students or more. So what immediately you might notice is the distinction that 48% of students were first generation compared to 52%. Okay, so it's almost half of students are first generation students. Now, if we look at the low income piece of this, then you'll see something very interesting. So here, the number of first generation students increases as the poverty level decreases. All right, so students that are at or below poverty or at the 200% level of poverty here can make up a big number compared to the second generation students. Once we break that 200% barrier, we start to see the number of first generation students decrease, and we start to see the number of second generation students increase. So that just goes back to the whole piece of first generation students are likely to be low income as well. And down here I have the kind of the breakdown to give you an idea of what these different calculations mean. And you can see that 76% of second generation students family makes $100,000 or more, whereas only 23% of first generation students do. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all first generation students are low income and all low income students aren't first generation. It just really depends. Now, what about looking at first generation by race? Well, we see something similar that we saw in the low income chart. So here, when we look at first generation and second generation by race, we can see that white students are less likely to be first generation students than Black or African American, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, American Indian, or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And then you'll see over here, again, it's the exact same thing. So white students are more likely to be second generation students. So as we move forward with this information, we can see that minority students that are first generation and low income can have some really significant barriers that's affecting their success. And it could range from having to work all the time, not being able to connect to the campus, not having the family support, not knowing what question to ask, the financial support, discrimination, microaggressions, a whole variety of things that minority students need to overcome, especially if they're first generation and low income. So there's a lot of challenges there that higher education needs to work through to help better serve these populations. So what can we do? How can we get these students engaged? Well, unfortunately, there's really no easy answer. But some things we can do is provide student employment. And by providing these students on-campus employment, whether it's an RA, a desk assistant, cafeteria worker, whatever it is, they're on campus. It provides them an income, it engages the student, it helps connect them with faculty and staff, and connects them to the institution. And we know from Tinto that connecting with faculty and staff and engaging the student is critical. Providing them income will help with the low income piece, and having them on campus will also help connect them to the institution. So student employment is critical. Work-study programs are critical for low-income student success and first generation, because first generation students will then have interactions with other faculty and staff where they're able to mentor and help guide them through these processes. Support programs can assist, particularly orientation during their first year. Students, first generation low-income students, are more likely to fail from their first to their second year and leave an institution for various reasons. So if we can just provide them extra support during their first year, whether it's student employment, academic support, academic preparation, faculty connectedness, whatever it is, then we can able to get them to that next year. And a lot of that can just be informing them of services, because they may not know about academic advising. They don't know that they need to speak to an advisor. They don't know that there's a first year experience program on campus. And just informing them of services can be a big difference. And then the other thing is considering the cost of student organizations. Because with high costs of student organizations, we're actually excluding individuals that may benefit very much from some of these organizations. So these are just 3 different ways that we can consider engagement for first generation and low income students. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time.